The topic for today is letters of credit and bank guarantees and the legal principles governing injunctions. By injunctions, I mean the temporary injunctions, and why this topic has been chosen for this session is that it is expected that with this commercial establishment of the commercial courts, a large chunk of cases pertaining to letters of credit and bank guarantees would be before the commercial courts for adjudications. Beginning with the LC, the letter of credit, let's start on with the definition itself. What's a documentary credit? What's a letter of credit? I believe many of you may have a fair idea of what a letter of credit is. You have been handling cases, but it's always better to have a deeper understanding of these financial instruments, as a better understanding may lead to better decisions in the future. Now, a documentary credit is, as I was saying, a financial contract. It is issued by an importer's bank, and it guarantees that an exporter will be paid once the conditions of the letter of credit have been met. Now, we are lucky to have a brilliant judgment of the Supreme Court recently, in which they defined a letter of credit, they provided the scope of a letter of credit. They, in fact, discussed the legal mechanism involved in a letter of credit transaction, the dynamics that are involved in an international sales transaction. It is this case by the title of Sasco versus Askari Commercial Bank. Now, it is reported as 2021 SCMR 558, and I would recommend that if you get time, you do read this judgment. It's a great judgment in terms of what a letter of credit is, and how at times an element of fraud is involved in a letter of credit, and how the courts have to handle those particular cases. I'll touch upon Sasco versus Askari Commercial Bank again in the later part of this judgment, but let's move on to the mechanism of a letter of credit. As you see, letter of credit transaction arises, in fact, originally from an underlying contract. The underlying or a primary contract. It is between a buyer and a seller. Now, because letter of credit are usually used in international transactions, so this buyer would be the importer and the seller would be the exporter. They enter into a sales contract, and this sales contract basically is the transaction which leads them to follow a course where they can reduce the risk. The exporter can reduce the risk of getting payment under letter of credit, and the buyer can reduce the risk of getting the delivery of the goods which are specified for the purposes of the transaction. Now, it works in a manner that the buyer or the importer would move an LC application before its own bank, which would be the issuing bank, and the issuing bank would then issue a letter of credit. That letter of credit would be reported to a nominated bank, which would be the bank which has to make payment to the seller or the exporter. Now, this credit, once it has been informed to the exporter that it is available, so the exporter under the transaction, it delivers the goods to the shipper or the carrier means the ship itself. So once the goods have been delivered to the carrier in return provides him or the company with the title documents of the shipping documents, which includes bill of lading and other documents. So once those bill of lading or other documents are received by the exporter, that exporter returns those documents to the nominated bank, and the nominated bank informs the issuing bank that the documents are there. The documents are checked by these banks, and if they are not discrepant, means if they comply with the terms of the letter of credit, the payment is made to the exporter. And besides that, because these documents have then to be returned to the buyer for the purposes of, so that once the goods have reached his country, it can be submitted to the carrier, and the carrier would release the goods to the importer. So this is how the whole transaction works, and this flow charts is basically a schematic representation of this mechanism. Now, you would appreciate that there are two different contracts. There is one contract which is a sales contract between the importer and the exporter. Now we have to remember that it is an independent contract. It's a separate contract. The other contract flows around the whole mechanism wherein the goods are being, and the documents and the payments are being made. That's another contract. So we have to appreciate this thing, that there are two different contracts in the whole LC transaction, and they work separately and independently. Now, what are the different types of LCs? The different types of LCs are irrevocable and revocable. The irrevocable LC is one which cannot be changed bilaterally or unilaterally by any of the parties. However, revocable LCs have become obsolete with the passage of time. They are no more in vogue. Then there are, by nature, the LCs can be of import nature, export nature, or even inland LCs. By import nature, it's basically a perspective. For an importer, it's an import LC. For an exporter, it is an export LC. And by inland LC, I mean LCs, which at times LCs are also used for inland transactions within the same state or country. Then by nature, there can also be a confirmed LC or an unconfirmed LC. Now, what is a confirmed LC? At times, there is a confirmation note in an LC that a confirming bank actually further guarantees. It's not an issuing bank, it guarantees that it would make the payment if the documents are not discrepant. That would be called a confirmed LC. Otherwise, all LCs are usually unconfirmed LCs. Now, by view of time, perspective of time, again, there are two types of LCs. There are LCs which are sight LCs, then LCs which are usance or deferred LCs. Now, by sight LC, I mean it's just like a bill of exchange, that whenever a bill of exchange or an LC is presented, the payment has to be made. And a usance or a deferred LC is one in which payment, even if the goods have been delivered, the payment can be delayed. It can be made subsequently after a passage of time. These are important concepts which you will be countering when an LC case will be before you as a commercial code. Now, what are different terms of LC? The different terms of LC are by its form, which I've already mentioned. Then in an LC document itself, then there are a number of terms, such as the number of LC, it's a specific number which is assigned. Then we have the applicable rules, means the rules under which the LC would govern, which I'll come to later in one of my slides. And then the place and expiry of the LC, the applicant, the beneficiary, who is the exporter, the currency in which the LC is going to work, the draft, by draft I mean the bill of exchange itself. It can be at site or usance, which I've already mentioned. It can be a partial or a transshipment based LC. The port of loading is described, the port of discharge is described, and date of issue, the beneficiary's name, period of presentation. These are all important terms of an LC, and they are specifically mentioned in the LC so that later on there is no discrepancy or conflict between the parties. Now, what are the different shipping documents which I mentioned in the flow chart which I showed? These are pro forma invoice on the basis of which LC is basically issued. Then there's a commercial invoice. There's not much difference between the two. The pro forma invoice is actually used in the beginning for the purpose of issuance of LC itself. Then there's a bill of lading. It's a very important document. Bill of lading is actually a receipt of the goods as well by the shipper, by the carrier, as well as it is a title document to the goods. And it is a document which has to be provided by the importer to the carrier so that the goods can be released to him once they have been imported in that country. Then there are documents like packing list, certificate of origin, insurance certificate, bill of exchange, which I mentioned is also known as draft. The communication in LC matters between banks, they usually take place by messages, and these messages are the SWIFT messages. The full form of SWIFT is basically it's a society for worldwide interbank financial telecommunications. So these are the codes basically which they use and by which the banks infer how an LC is being governed and what discrepancies they have to remove within the documents. Now, I just mentioned about the rules. Under what rules the LC is governed. LC is governed under international rules. These rules have been framed by the International Chamber of Commerce. It's in the headquarters is in Paris, and the purpose of these rules has been that there shouldn't be a disparity between different countries, because in international trade, if one country has different set of rules pertaining to payments under LCs and another country has different set of rules, definitely there can be a conflict. To avoid that conflict, in 1920s, 1930s, the International Chamber of Commerce came up with this Uniform Customs and Practice for Documentary Credits rules, which we call as UCP, and the present version of UCP, last year revised in 2007, is the UCP 600. So when we have to see whether the LC is compliant, under what rules the LC, under what law the LC is being governed in terms of global transactions, it is the UCP 600, and that is very much relevant for the courts as well when deciding cases. All proof of shipping documents and is all there, how it's to be proved when it comes to UCP 600. But do remember that UCP 600 is only applicable to irrevocable LCs, and that is what I told you earlier. It is the irrevocable LC which is in vogue. The other one has become, revocable one has become obsolete. Now, this is one of the most important slides in my presentation. If you may focus on this slide, it may help you while deciding your cases in the commercial court if they pertain to LCs. The limit, yes, the limit is there. The limit is there. The amount is there. Actually, it's not the limit. It's actually the specific figure which is to be mentioned. Means, for example, what's the figure of the quantity which is being exported as goods? What is the figure of the value of the goods that is taken from the commercial or the pro forma invoice itself? That is mentioned. That is mentioned. Everything is mentioned in the LC. And in my terms, I mentioned that the value of the goods and the quantity of the goods and the value of the goods has to be specifically mentioned. And the goods should comply with the same. There can be an error. A UCP 600 does provide a margin of error of plus 5% or minus 5%, but not more than that. Yes. Yes, I'll come to that. That is in the later part of my presentation. These are basically, yes, this is a very relevant question. And this will come when I'll be discussing the cases itself. What cases have, what jurisprudence has been developed, and the cases which have been decided by the Honorable Supreme Court. So the first principle, but I'll do remember your question when I'll answer to that at that time. First principle, which is very important pertaining to LCs, is the autonomy principle or the independence principle. This is particularly mentioned in the SASCO judgment of the Supreme Court. And there are certain principles which you have to remember definitely as a judge of the commercial court, because without that, you may not really appreciate the case of the parties. Firstly, that banks have nothing to do with the underlying contract between the buyer and seller. As I told you, there are two different contracts. The sales contract between the parties is a separate independent contract. And the LC contract or LC transaction is something different. You cannot mix these two up. So, and you have to remember that banks have to encash the LCs. Banks have nothing to do with what the sales contract is. Banks have again nothing to do with what the dispute between the two parties is. There may be a dispute between the parties, as you just mentioned, that the goods are of inferior quality. Perhaps the goods that were exported and have been imported into the country are later checked on by the importer, and he finds that they are of inferior quality, or they do not comply with the specifications which were mentioned in the commercial invoice or the LC itself. But the remedies are different. Still, the banks have to encash that LC. There are certain exceptions, but those exceptions are only in extreme circumstances, which I will specifically point out in my presentation. So, any dispute between the parties, it is irrelevant for the purpose of LC. The autonomy or the independence of an LC has to be maintained. The banks are bound to honor the LC if the LC documents are being presented and they are compliant with what were required under the LC. The banks are bound, means there is no exception to that. The bank's obligation is defined by the terms of the LC itself. It has nothing to do with whether the goods are not in accordance, whether the documents are yes, there is an exception of forged documents, which I'll come to later. But as far as if the documents are complying with the terms of LC itself, the bank has to honor that LC, and the payment has to be made to the beneficiary or the exporter. Then there is another principle, which is the doctrine of strict compliance. Now, again, it's a very important principle, because we have to remember that banks deal with documents and not with goods. Banks have nothing to do with goods. I mean, again, the same question I'm responding. Banks would not deal with the goods. It is for then the courts in subsequent proceedings or the parties later on, when it will be decided, that they may see that thing, but not at the time of grant of temporary injunctions. So because banks deal with documents, so if the documents comply with the LC, the banks would encash that LC in favor of the beneficiary. The banks would not stop the payment. Banks are not obliged to make payments only if they are not complying with the terms of the LC. Means if not, the legal term we use in UCP 600 is the complying presentation. And if it is not a complying presentation, means if LC says something, but the document says something else, then it has a right to refuse. Otherwise, it has no right to refuse the encashment of the LC in favor of the beneficiary. Yes, there are clauses. Yes, they would be adjudicated by the courts, but how? I'll come to that later. Well, presently I'm focusing on the temporary injunction. Importer says that I imported these goods, the payment has yet to be made. I've already asked the bank to stop the payment, but the goods are of inferior quality, or they are not of the quality which was agreed by us in terms of our invoice. At that time, the court cannot grant a temporary injunction. There are only certain exceptional circumstances in which it can grant, and they're very few. Otherwise, it cannot grant. The matter would be adjudicated later on in trial through evidence. Yes, it would be adjudicated whether at that time the court won't be seeing not just the LC transaction, but the main sales contract, whether the sales contract has been breached by the exporter. That what the court has to see at that stage. Even then, the burden would be upon the importer if there has been a fraud, or if the specifications have not been met by the exporter while exporting the goods to the country. So, what are the different nature of cases that the courts are expected to adjudicate, the commercial courts particularly, by the beneficiary or the exporter? Those would be the cases pertaining to payments against LC. For example, let's say some importer comes and he gets the payment stopped under the LC from the bank. So the courts would see the exporter would approach the court, commercial court, and would say that my payment has not been paid. So an injunction may be passed, or a direction may be given to the importer to make the payment, or the bank to make the payment, because it's under the terms of LC. So that are the cases which we expect from the exporter or the beneficiary. From the buyer or the importer side, we expect cases that may lead to breach of contract, which we just mentioned, where the goods are of the quality which are not of an inferior quality, or there's a breach of contract, they do not comply with the terms of the contract. Yes, the buyer can approach the court and he can get a relief from the commercial court. What nature of suits we expect? We expect suits pertaining to relief such as permanent injunction, damages, specific performance, declaration, and of like nature. Now, the focus because of this presentation has been applications for restraining encashment of LCs through temporary injunctions, because it's a very hot topic, and the things have to be decided off and on by the courts, and they're very material at that stage. So I'll be focusing on those particular cases. But there's another exception, that at times the courts there's a confusion that perhaps all LC cases can be brought to, before the commercial court. No, that's not the case. At times there are cases pertaining to an LC that is between the buyer or the importer and his bank, means the issuing bank, and that is pertaining to the finance facility, because the issuing bank issues a letter of guarantee for a consideration. What's the consideration? It provides the finance to the buyer, and for that it issues an LC in favor of the exporter, and in return the buyer has to return the finance by way of markup or interest. So this transaction cannot be governed by, or doesn't come within the jurisdiction of the commercial court. They are the banking courts established for this purpose. They are special courts under the Financial Institutions Recovery of Finances Ordinance 2001, and it would be those courts which would have jurisdiction when the cases pertain to the buyer and his bank. So a beneficiary cannot jump in that case. He cannot interfere. The beneficiary cannot approach the banking court to say that to ask for a relief against a bank so that the bank may encash a payment in its favor under the letter of credit. It cannot do so. For that, it would have to come before the commercial court. The banking court would have no jurisdiction for that, because banking court's jurisdiction is limited to the bank and its customer, and the customer is only the buyer. The beneficiary is not a customer of the bank. Yes, finance. Finance matters when the bank has financed. Yes, only in finance matters. That was an exception, and there are judgments by the Honorable Lahore High Court as well as the Honorable Sindh High Court. And I've mentioned these judgments, Mia Mahmood Ahmad versus HSBC case, and we have this Procter and Gamble case, which specifically held that beneficiary of an LC cannot invoke banking jurisdiction of the court. Now, I'll also touch upon bank guarantees. Why bank guarantees has been included with this topic, otherwise LC itself is a comprehensive subject, is that because there are many similarities between a letter of credit and a bank guarantee, especially when it comes to the autonomy principle. The principle of independence means even in a bank guarantee, you cannot see the main dispute between the parties. There may be a dispute between the parties, but if it is an unconditional bank guarantee, the bank has to make the payment whenever it is called for by the beneficiary. So that what makes it similar to the letter of credit. So what's a bank guarantee? Again, it's a bank's commitment to honor payment to the beneficiary, but in which there is a failure in fulfillment of contractual obligations by the other party, on whose basis it has issued the bank guarantee. Now, bank guarantee, because it's a guarantee, it's definitely governed by Section 126 of the Contract Act. And where it is used, it is mostly used in real estate matters, construction work, supply of goods, and you'll be facing a lot of cases pertaining to bank guarantees as well, for the reason that it's a financial instrument which is often unused in almost all commercial transactions. Now, what are the salient features of guarantee? What are its contents? Again, the guarantee number is there, the name of the bank beneficiary, contractor or buyer is there, the amount is specifically mentioned, the purpose of guarantee, validity period, last date of lodging claim, or the conditions in which it is to be invoked. Usually the guarantees which are issued these days are unconditional guarantees. However, a guarantee can be conditional too. So what are the different types of bank guarantees? They can be, bank guarantee itself it's a generic term. I mean, there are different types of bank guarantees these days. We have performance guarantees to secure the performance by the contractor. Then we have mobilization advance guarantee, when an advance is given in the beginning in a contract, an amount is given and that is guaranteed through this bank guarantee. Again, then there are payment guarantees to secure the payment, and then there are deferred payment guarantees when the payment is to be made and, by way of installments by the contractor, and it is to be, so the guarantee is also a deferred guarantee. Yes, that can be an exception. That can be an exception, but it should be a convincing argument. It should, the court should be convinced, and how the court, it shouldn't be a mere allegation. It's not just mere allegation. There should be adducing evidence, even at that stage, even before the trial. Yeah, there should be a prima facie. Yes, the court. Yes, the court can issue a temporary injunction. The court can stay the encashment of that guarantee. There are the two exceptions as well. I'll be coming to the other two exceptions as well. There's irretrievable justice and special equities. But the exception of fraud has to be adduced and should be compelling. There should be compelling evidence, no doubt, at a prima facie stage. It shouldn't be just that by merely relying on the affidavit or merely relying on the argument. The argument should be reasoned, and in my view, the order definitely should provide some reasoning, even at the point of ad interim injunction, that this is the reason that an encashment needs to be restrained in that particular case. The court takes care of these things. The court would has to do justice. It won't let anyone suffer, but there are certain exceptions in the law, and the objective is again to ensure justice. So there are judgments of the Honorable Supreme Court, and I'll come to those judgments. They would assist you in terms how to decide whether a particular case is one in which the encashment has to be restrained or not. So the general rule, as we need to remember, is that in cases of even LC and unconditional bank guarantees, courts should be generally reluctant to grant any ad interim injunction or a temporary injunction. I mean, there is no need actually, unless you really, I mean, there is a very strong case that from the documents that yes, encashment needs to be restrained here. And there's a difference between LC and bank guarantee as well. The difference is that in LC, whenever the conditions of the LC are met, the encashment has to be made by the bank. But in the bank guarantee, it is to be first claimed, the person, the principal or the beneficiary has to first claim it from the principal debtor to make me the payment. But if the payment is not made, then it will approach the bank. But the bank, whenever it will approach the bank will have to make the payment. Can't refuse, unless certain exceptions arise, which have been mentioned. Yes, it cannot be refused. But if there is a fraud, which is apparent from the face of record, yes, it can refuse. For the court. First party, the burden would be on the first party. Yes, the burden would be upon that first party. No, not for the benefit. Until unless the first party has discharged the burden, yes, it makes out a strong prima facie case in which, even if irreparable loss, there is an exception. Strong prima facie case in which the encashment needs to be restrained. Yes, good. Exceptions, I'm coming to the exceptions. Now it's again an important part of my presentation here. Fraud. Now I'm reiterating that it needs to be a clear fraud on the part of beneficiary, and again the bank should have notice of that fraud. Even if the bank does not have a notice and the bank has encashed, there is no issue. The bank, that fraud needs to be bring into the notice of the bank, even before the court. You need to bring that thing in the notice of the bank, so that the bank is in the knowledge that if the guarantee has to be encashed, there is a fraud which has been informed by the party. But again, then bank is not in a position definitely to stop or the payment. It would be the court which can, seeing that particular exception or fraud, which can grant a restraining order, not the bank. Not the bank cannot refuse by itself, because if it's an unconditional guarantee, it would be for the court to grant an interim injunction if it feels like that a case has been made out. Because, and the principle. Court can still do it. Court can still do it because there are judgments. Even if they are not part and parcel, the court can still invoke, seeing from the circumstances of the case. It depends on circumstances. For example, like there was a condition of COVID-19 in the last few months, when there were a lot of bank guarantees which were to be encashed, and the courts could have, on the clause of force majeure, even if there was no clause, could have done so, because the reason being that the courts itself, many of them were not functioning. There was even a notification of section 144 CRPC by the government itself. The parties could not come out, the construction could not be made by many contractors. So it made out a very good condition on the principle of special equities, where a force majeure could be invoked even if the clause was not there in the contract. But again, it depends on in times of war, in times of internal conflict, the clause of or the provision of force majeure, even if there is no express clause in the contract, can be invoked in these circumstances. So the principle when it comes to fraud is the same principle that fraud vitiates the Solomon of the proceedings. So that's why this exception has been created under the law. Then there's another exception which is of irretrievable injury or injustice. This exception pertains to matters, again, internal conflicts, wars, or where there's been a substantial performance of the contract. There are circumstances perhaps where 80% of the work has been done by a contractor. Only 20 means a substantial performance has been made, but only 20% is left. And just because of that 20%, there is a dispute between the parties, and one of the parties comes to asks the bank to encash the whole guarantee, even which comprises of the 80%. In those circumstances, irretrievable injury or injustice exception can be invoked by the court. Now, SASCO versus Askari Commercial Bank, as I mentioned, I would be returning to this judgment. It was an interesting judgment in which one of the parties, SASCO, it entered into a contract with a party in UK, and the purpose was for the import of acrylic goods. And the bill of lading, which was issued, which was alleged by SASCO, subsequently the bill of lading, SASCO actually did not receive the delivery of those goods. And the bill of lading was in fact forged, which it alleged. Now the burden was upon SASCO to establish that the fraud had been committed, which burden it failed to discharge during the proceedings, during the recovery suit it filed against its bank. So it's an important judgment again. Why? Because it discusses the rule of autonomy, and which is not absolute, and there is an exception of fraud in it. Now coming to certain important cases of the Supreme Court when it comes to the encashment of LCs. One of the important cases in which we find a lot of principles, and this case is more than sufficient when it comes to a lot of principles which have been reiterated, which have been discussed by the Honorable Supreme Court. I would recommend that you particularly read this case, Haral Textiles versus Banque Indosuez, Belgium. Now, in this particular case, Haral Textiles was a company which entered into a contract with a Belgian firm for the import of machinery. However, when the machinery was imported, it was found of inferior quality. In fact, Haral Textiles incurred losses by using that particular machinery. So Haral Textiles filed a case before the trial court, and it prayed for a temporary injunction. The trial court did issue an injunction, temporary injunction, in which it restrained the respondents from, or the defendants from getting the payment under the guarantee, but subject to their deposit, they furnish a bank guarantee. So this was challenged by the defendants before the High Court. The High Court dismissed, set aside the order of the trial court that no temporary injunction could have been issued. The matter came before this Honorable Supreme Court, and the Honorable Supreme Court held that, again, the same principles, that it's a different obligation. It's separately, even if there is a dispute between the parties pertaining to inferior goods, the LC could not have been restrained. So it particularly held that any dispute between the seller and purchaser is of extraneous nature. In this particular case, in fact, the beneficiary or the exporter had, in fact, there had been a holder in due course. The bill of exchange have been transferred to another party. So even that, the Supreme Court held that even that particular LC would stand in even a higher pedestal, which could not be restrained by the court. And it particularly mentioned that the only exceptional circumstances, which I have just also mentioned, that there is a fraud, clear fraud, can the court restrain the particular LC. But in this particular case, there was no allegation of fraud. There was just a dispute between the parties as to the contract breached by the exporter. Now, with regard to bank guarantee, again, there is a very important judgment by the Honorable Supreme Court. It is this Shipyard K. Demon case, in which, in fact, it's again a very comprehensive judgment for the reason that it mentions luckily both bank guarantees as well as LCs. It provides the nature and effect of both these. It provides the ground for the temporary injunctions, the theory of non-interference by the courts in respect of bank guarantees and letters of credit. In fact, the Supreme Court applied certain tests. It gave a mechanism, in fact, to the lower courts as well for the future, that how to determine whether the demand of restraining encashment of a guarantee has to be tested on what pedestal. There were questions like which the Supreme Court put before itself, whether the demand for enforcing the bank guarantees has been made strictly in accordance with the terms of the document. In that particular case, the answer was yes, that yes, the demand was rightly made by the beneficiary. The second question which it put was whether there was an allegation of fraud against the beneficiary. In that particular case, there was no allegation of fraud, so the court answered in no. And the third question which it put was whether there was any special equity arising out of a particular situation or a strong prima facie arguable case against the enforcement of bank guarantee. When it comes to those special equities, the answer was again no. So on the basis of these questions, the court then decided the case, and it said that the bank guarantee needs to be encashed. There is no case is made out for restraining the encashment of that particular guarantee. And again, the same principles were laid down by the Honorable Supreme Court, that it lies on the similar footing of an LC. It's an independent contract, and that it has to be honored because it's an independent contract, the principle of autonomy, and it cannot be restrained. Now, there have been other judgments too of the Honorable Supreme Court, like we have the National Construction versus Evan Iqbal Authority case. It's pertaining to the same Evan Iqbal in Lahore, in which a contract was given to National Construction Company for the construction of that Evan Iqbal.